I cheated on my boyfriend because he snores too loudly, and my best friend offered me a night at his place. He said he doesn't snore, and that after intimacy, I could sleep peacefully. I had no other choice. The worst part wasn't just even that Esteban looked at me like I was a monster, but that he did it with that confidence of a professional victim, as if he hadn't been in my debt for years. I stayed in the living room with my phone in my hand and the air heavy, because suddenly everything became a judgment, but not the right one. And yes, I'm going to explain because what I did was a necessary measure, even if it burns some people's conscience. Esteban, my boyfriend, and I have lived together for 3 years, and at first I thought I was choosing stability, decency, a life with a calm man. I met him at a time when I was looking for peace, not fireworks or drama, and he seemed to be just that, someone serene, with simple habits, who didn't need to prove anything. I liked that he was kind to waiters, that he spoke quietly, that he wasn't one of those men who live competing. In the first few months, he made me feel safe, as if I could finally let my guard down and build a home with clear rules. I, who have always believed in order, respect, and dignity, thought he would live up to the bare minimum. Living together at the beginning was almost nice, at least in appearance, because I'm a person who knows how to maintain a proper environment. I cooked, he cleaned, we had schedules. We shopped together, and people even said we looked good as an adult couple. Esteban was one of those men who are proud of not complicating things, and that in theory should be a virtue. I saw in him a partner who could follow a routine and respect a space, and that for me was almost sacred. I didn't need him to serenade me or write poems. I needed him to be considerate. At that point, Esteban still seemed like a teachable man, capable of improving. Over time, however, I began to notice that subtle ways certain people have of believing that the world accommodates them by default. It wasn't overt malice. It was something worse, a quiet indifference. Esteban could see that I was tired and still start a conversation as if my energy were a shared resource. He could leave things anywhere and then say with that childish smile that he didn't even notice. And at first I corrected him patiently because I'm one of those who teach, who guide, who raise the standard. Not because I'm perfect, but because someone has to hold the bar when the other gets used to living in mediocrity. Along the same lines, I was always very strict about rest. For me, sleeping isn't a whim, it's mental health, it's emotional stability, it's the basis for being a functional and, above all, dignified person. I work, I support my life. I can't afford to be irritable or unbalanced from poor nights of sleep. And Esteban knew it because I told him very clearly from the beginning. I explained that my mood depends on my sleep, that my peace depends on my sleep, and that if he said he loved me, he should at least protect that. He swore he understood, and even said it with a solemn tone, as if he were signing a pact. But there are promises people make just to turn the page, and Esteban turned out to be an expert at that. At some point, what I had seen as tranquility became passivity, and what I had seen as simplicity became negligence. The little things started to pile up, and I began to feel that I was the only adult in the house. I set limits, I organized, I avoided unnecessary arguments, I cushioned his social blunders, I maintained the image of a proper couple, and he, instead of being grateful, got comfortable as if my effort were the natural floor of the world. It doesn't seem unfair to me to demand reciprocity. It seems the bare minimum. In parallel, I have a best friend, David, from before Esteban. David was always that person who understands without you having to explain so much. It's not that he's perfect, it's that he listens, which is already more than what many offer. David knows when you're at your limit. He knows how to read those silences where you no longer have the patience to educate anyone. It was never a problem because I know how to separate roles, I know how to maintain the correct boundaries, and I never allowed confusion. Esteban knew him, greeted him, even benefited from David being a present and reliable person in my life. And still, Esteban had that way of underestimating human dynamics, as if everything were black and white, and loyalty were just a slogan. What Esteban never seriously took on was that the body also has limits. At some point the snoring started, and at first it was almost anecdotal. I thought it was a tired day, congestion, a bad night's sleep, something temporary, but no. It became a cruel routine, a nightly assault that he carried out with total impunity. It was as if every night, when I turned off the light looking for calm, he turned on an internal siren that dragged me to despair. I moved, I touched him gently. I tried to turn him, I tried to breathe deeply and endure, because at first you don't want to be the woman who complains about everything, but patience also runs out when your health is at stake. I told him, and not once, I told him as important things are said, with clarity, with arguments, without insults. I explained that I woke up several times, that I got up as if I hadn't slept, that my head hurt, and that my performance was deteriorating. I proposed reasonable solutions, that he consult a doctor, that he check if he had any respiratory problems, that we change habits, even that he try sleeping on his side. Esteban responded with that typical minimization of someone who doesn't suffer the problem, as if my exhaustion were a theatrical exaggeration.
He laughed.
He said that's how everyone snores, that it's not a big deal, that I also snore sometimes, as if it were the same. And every time he did it, I felt that my partner wasn't my companion, but my obstacle. I tried to be understanding for longer than any reasonable person would have endured. I bought earplugs, changed pillows, put on white noise, moved schedules, adjusted routines as if I had to adapt to someone else's lack of consideration. I began to sleep fragmented, to wake up with contained anger, to feel that my house was no longer a refuge, but a trench. And the most humiliating thing is that when you're sleep-deprived, you become more vulnerable, more fragile, more impulsive. I'm not an impulsive person by nature. I'm a person who thinks. But Esteban was pushing me to the edge, and he did it with a smile because nothing was happening to him. There were nights where I watched him sleep with that tranquility of someone who isn't breaking anyone, and I thought about how unfair it is that the greatest damage is always suffered by the one trying to maintain order. I would stay there counting minutes, listening to the sound like a constant mockery, and the next day I acted normal, as if I hadn't been in a battle. He would say, "Good morning," and ask me for coffee as if he hadn't stolen my entire night. That's the kind of selfishness that isn't shouted, but feels like abandonment. And I honestly started to feel that if I didn't do something drastic, I was going to end up exploding in a way that would be a real sin. In that context, David appeared as a logical way out, not romantic, logical. One night, after seeing me with dark circles, irritated, with skin like a person who doesn't rest, he asked me what was wrong, and I finally said it without makeup, that Esteban was killing my sleep with his snoring. David didn't laugh, didn't minimize, didn't make jokes. He simply said that it was serious and that I didn't have to put up with it. He talked about sleep deprivation as modern domestic abuse, and yes, it sounds harsh, but when you live it you understand. And that's when he made me the offer, that if I needed to sleep a full night, I could stay at his house, in his bed, in silence. It was a proposal of care, of support, of common sense. I hesitated because I know how it looks. I know how people reduce everything to sex, as if the body were the only thing that matters. But David, with a calm that Esteban never had, told me that in addition to silence, he could help me release accumulated stress that sometimes the body needs to discharge to be able to rest. And I, after months of being on the edge, understood that what I was doing was avoiding a greater tragedy. It wasn't about seeking pleasure. It was about recovering my humanity before becoming someone unrecognizable. I wasn't choosing chaos. I was choosing the peace that was denied to me in my own home. The night I accepted, I did it with a cold clarity. It wasn't an impulsive madness. It was an act of survival with an inevitable didactic component. If Esteban wasn't capable of taking something as basic as rest seriously, then he needed a consequence that would teach him that my limits exist. David received me like a gentleman, without drama, without unnecessary questions, and delivered exactly what he said. Silence, support, and that intimacy that did happen because I'm not a statue, and I'm also a human being with nerves, tension, and exhaustion. And after that, for the first time in months, I slept. I slept like you sleep when your body finally stops being on alert. When your mind shuts off without fear. The next morning, I didn't feel guilty. I felt lucid. I felt like someone who had regained control of her life. I returned home with a calm that Esteban doesn't deserve, but I do. I looked in the mirror and told myself that I was willing to forgive him, to give him another chance, because I'm not resentful when the other learns. I was convinced that my bodily sacrifice, if anyone wants to call it that, had saved our life together. Because if I had stayed there night after night, I would have ended up doing something truly unforgivable, like smashing a pillow in his face in a fit of desperation. I chose the civilized way. I chose the method that avoids blood. And the most ironic thing is that I returned willing to move forward, with renewed energy to tolerate his imperfections, as if I had cleansed an internal poison. But life has a way of punishing those who try to do the right thing, because Esteban didn't react like someone who understands the lesson. His immediate and brutal reaction was the breakdown, a total lack of understanding of what I did to keep our house standing. I hadn't returned to demand anything from him yet. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't asked for applause. I had returned with peace. And still, I knew that the moment he found out, if he found out, he would try to turn my act of survival into a cheap story of betrayal. And I was already prepared to defend the truth, that the real immorality was his chronic indifference to my well-being. Main story comments. Anonymous user 1 says, "So, according to you, you slept with your friend as if he were melatonin. How convenient is your morality? Your boyfriend snores, and you go off to survive in another bed. What a heroine." OP's reply. People like you think morality is a meme, and that's why you live in chaos. I didn't sleep around for sport. I took an extreme measure because Esteban was destroying my health, and he did it laughing. If you think it's normal for a woman to be consumed by lack of sleep while the other sleeps like a happy pig, then your ethical standard is very low and your opinion brings me nothing. Anonymous user I says, "I had no choice," she says, "as if David put a gun to your head and the bed came with mandatory intimacy. The worst part is you convinced yourself you were teaching a lesson." OP's reply, "Don't feign naivety, because it's obvious you're only interested in humiliating and not understanding. When you're at your limit, options are reduced, and you choose what preserves stability, not what sounds pretty for strangers to applaud." And yes, it was a lesson. Because adults learn with consequences, not with your cheap speeches of purity that only serve to point fingers. Update 1. 2 days have passed since the last update, and what impacts me most isn't that Esteban found out, but the vulgar way he chose to react. I was at home trying to maintain a decent atmosphere, as I've always done. When I saw him start to walk with that energy of an offended man who thinks the world owes him an ovation for feeling, he asked for my phone with a brusqueness unbecoming of someone who claims to love. And then I knew he had already found something, because paranoia doesn't come from nowhere. When he saw a message from David, he didn't have a second of shame for what he forced me to seek. His first response was to shout, not to reflect, as if volume gave him the right. I looked at him calmly, because someone had to maintain dignity in that scene. The first thing I explained was the obvious, that he was in no position to be indignant, because my action was a direct consequence of his negligence. I told him with that didactic tone I use when I speak to people who prefer emotion to thought. I reminded him of the months of complaints, the broken nights, the proposed solutions, and his constant laughter, and I told him that mine wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Esteban, instead of accepting logic, tried to reduce it to a dirty phrase, using vulgar words to describe me, as if dirtying the language made him innocent. That's the technique of the mediocre, to drag you down to the mud, so it seems like everyone is the same. I didn't enter his mud, because I leave the mud to those who need it to justify themselves. When I saw that he continued to act as if he were a victim, I decided to set clear limits and a concrete penance, because without penance there's no learning. I told him that if he wanted to talk about morality, then we were going to talk about complete morality, not convenient morality. I explained that my infidelity was his penance for not having no surgery, for not taking care of himself, for not taking my health seriously, and that if he was as much of a man as he claimed, he would accept his part. Esteban mocked as if it were funny that a relationship is sustained by effort and responsibility. Then I understood that he wasn't looking for repair, he was looking for punishment towards me to feel superior, and I wasn't going to allow that in my house. So I imposed a practical punishment on him. He wasn't going to sleep in the bed until I considered that he had atoned for his guilt. Not out of cruelty, but out of consistency. If his body was the weapon that harmed me at night, then the first step was for him to stop occupying the privileged space, as if nothing had happened. Esteban acted as if I were taking away a human right when in reality, I was setting a basic limit. I pointed to the floor with a blanket and told him that this was temporary but necessary. I clarified that it wasn't about humiliation but about discipline, because without discipline, he would never change. And yes, I know it sounds harsh, but people learn when they feel the weight of what they did. Esteban's reaction was the typical disaster of someone who can't stand having a mirror held up to them. He looked at me with a disgust I don't deserve, because I'm not a criminal. I'm someone who tried to save a relationship. He said I was crazy, that I was cruel, that I had no right to impose anything, as if I hadn't endured his silent cruelty for months. He didn't care that I was speaking calmly. For him, my calm was provocation. He threw comments at me, and the worst part is he did it with that confidence of someone who believes the public would support him. I told him the problem wasn't my punishment, it was his pride. I told him that if he were a decent man, he would apologize to me for pushing me to seek rest outside the home, and that apology was the first brick to rebuild. But Esteban refused to accept his responsibility, and that refusal is what truly reveals emotional immaturity. Instead of arguing with class, he grabbed his keys as if he were in a movie and announced he was going to a hotel. And he said it as a threat, as if leaving me alone were a punishment for me, when in reality, it was an involuntary gift. I stayed in the living room with the feeling that he preferred to pay for a bed rather than accept that he had failed. It seemed so symbolic that I almost laughed. Suddenly, he could find quick solutions. Suddenly, he could act. What he couldn't do was admit that I was right. The most outrageous thing was that he left without acknowledging the harm he caused me, without accepting that my action was provoked by his disdain. He left the place with that attitude of I'm the wounded one, and I was left with my righteousness, as always, holding the moral weight of the relationship. The first few hours alone were strange, because the silence had a bitter taste. It wasn't peace, it was a reminder that he was choosing pride. I sat down and thought it was impressive how people prefer to run away rather than grow. I wondered if I was really dating an adult or a big teenager who thinks going to a hotel erases his guilt. And still, I didn't collapse, because I'm not one of those women who throws herself on the floor for a confused man. That night, ironically, I slept better without him, and that confirmed something that hurt me to accept. My house worked better when he wasn't there. I woke up, and for a moment I had a clean peace. And then I remembered that this wasn't a deserved rest, it was a pause in an absurd war. It bothered me to think that he was probably telling himself a story where I was the absolute villain, because people like that always need a villain, so they don't have to look at themselves. I checked my phone and saw messages from him full of reproaches and cheap morality, as if he had suddenly become a defender of universal fidelity. I didn't answer immediately, because you don't respond to a tantrum, you respond when the other person lowers their head. And I was honestly hoping he would come back with humility. What worried me, however, was the feeling that he wasn't learning anything, that he was using this as an excuse to feel virtuous. I knew that if I didn't take control, he was going to turn a lesson into a spectacle. I thought about his family, his friends, about how he could start narrating himself as a martyr, and it made me angry because I was the one who endured the real damage. I was the one who tried solutions. I was the one who put up with the wear and tear. I was the one who had to resort to extreme measures so as not to destroy him. And now he wanted to put a cross on me, as if I had enjoyed hurting him. At that point, I understood that what was coming wasn't going to be a mature conversation, it was going to be a battle of narratives. By the second day, my patience began to run out, not because of guilt, but because of injustice. I kept telling myself that my act had moral coherence because it did, and that if he was unable to see it, then the problem was his inability to take responsibility. I told myself I wasn't going to beg for understanding because I don't beg for anything. But I also understood that his escape to the hotel was a dangerous move, because distance tends to inflate egos, and Esteban is one of those who quickly become convinced of their own version. And so, With all the weight of my righteousness on my shoulders, I prepared for whatever he planned as a response, because it was already clear it wasn't going to be a humble return. Update comments.
1.
Anonymous user 1 says, punishment. Penance. You don't want a partner. You want a submissive monk. On top of that, you send him to the floor as if you were his mother, and then you're surprised he leaves. Opie's reply, what you call submissive, I call responsibility, but I understand that some people are scared of it because they've never maintained a relationship with standards. If someone damages my health for months and laughs, they don't deserve privileges until they make amends. It's that simple. And if he left, it was because his pride is bigger than his love, not because I did something unfair. Anonymous user 2 says, you slept with your best friend and still have the audacity to demand apologies for the tone. That's not righteousness. It's delirium with a religious vocabulary. Opie's reply, what you call delirium is a more developed conscience than yours. That's why it makes you uncomfortable. I don't demand apologies out of whim. I demand respect, because no one has the right to yell at me as if I were trash. Especially someone who failed me first. If you can't understand the difference between pedagogical punishment and emotional violence, then your moral compass is broken, and I don't care about your cheap diagnosis. Update 2. A week has passed since the last update and Esteban returned, but not as a repentant man or as someone willing to make amends, but as a stranger with eyes trained to punish. I was in the house maintaining normality with a discipline he has never had because someone has to prevent everything from turning into an emotional dumpster. When I heard the key in the door, I felt a momentary relief, not because I needed him, but because I thought he would finally acknowledge the obvious. He came in without a proper greeting, with an almost calculated coldness, and the first thing I saw was that he was carrying moving boxes. He didn't even take the time to feign respect. He came to impose a theatrical act where he was the hero saving himself from me. And yes, that kind of theatricality disgusts me, because it's the most cowardly way to not face guilt. I tried to maintain a high tone because when you lower your level you become just like them. I asked him what that meant, and he answered with short sentences, as if he were talking to an enemy, not the woman who sustained at home when he turned it into a nightly torture chamber. He told me he was going to take his things, that this was over, and he said it with a calm he never had when I cried from exhaustion for not sleeping. It was a borrowed calm, the calm of someone who rehearsed his character for a whole week in a hotel. I told him he was destroying a home that was built with sacrifice, and that it was absurd to throw away 3 years for a sexual technicality, because that's what it was, a technicality caused by his negligence. He didn't even blink, as if he were enjoying the martyr's posture. The first event was precisely that, seeing that he didn't come to talk, he came to execute an exit, as if I were a defective object being returned. I tried to make him see reason with the basics, with the human, with the moral. I reminded him that I was willing to forgive, that I was willing to continue, that I'm not one to give up at the first stumble. I explained that I made a slip because he left me with no options, and that if he truly loved this relationship, his job now was to learn and repair. Esteban reacted with that cruel silence that makes you feel like you're talking to a wall. And when a wall thinks it's a judge, the only way is to remind it that it has no spiritual authority. That's when I made a necessary decision to appeal to family values, because Esteban has always been weak in the eyes of his family, not out of real respect, but for image. And image is the language he understands. I told him that if he dared to leave me like this, I was going to tell his mother what he did to me. The sleep deprivation, the daily mistreatment, and the negligence, because a woman who loves doesn't stay silent when a man becomes unfair. It wasn't blackmail, it was a call to shame, that shame that is sometimes the only brake on the ego. I reminded him that his mother has always treated me like a daughter, that she wouldn't tolerate knowing that her son destroyed my health for months, and then played the saint over one episode. I expected that to hit him, to activate a minimum of conscience, but what came was a response that showed he had already planned everything to set his scene. The second event, an unexpected consequence of the first, was that Esteban pulled out papers. He literally pulled out a recent medical diagnosis, as if he were a lawyer and not a boyfriend. and put it in front of my face with a silent satisfaction. He told me he had sleep apnea, and he said it with that tone of, "See, I am responsible." As if discovering a medical condition erased the months of minimization and mockery. Then he pulled out the receipt for a CPAP machine, that silent oxygen mask, and told me he bought it the day he went to the hotel, that is, the day he decided to play the victim. That same day, he was capable of finding a solution. That same day, he cared about the problem. That same day, he acted like the man I had been asking for months, and he showed it to me as proof of his goodness. As if I had to applaud him for finally doing what he should have done from the beginning. I was frozen, not with guilt, but with moral indignation. Because what he was trying to do was rewrite history, to turn my desperation into evil and his belated responsibility into holiness. He uttered a phrase that was a carefully calculated stab, that the problem had a solution, but that I prefer to sleep with David rather than accompany him to the doctor. And that phrase, although it sounds convincing to superficial people, is a blatant manipulation. Where was he when I begged him to go to the doctor? Where was his urgency when I woke up crying from exhaustion? Where was his responsibility when he laughed in my face? He only acted when he could use the solution as a weapon against me. That's not virtue, that's strategy. I tried to answer him with the dignity the situation required, because I wasn't going to let him present me as the only guilty one. I told him that his diagnosis didn't absolve him of the sin of indifference, that a condition doesn't justify contempt, and that if he had acted sooner, none of this would have happened. I told him that his CPAP was a monument to everything he didn't want to do for me on time. Esteban didn't even discuss the substance because the substance incriminates him. He just looked at me as if I were a nuisance. And then I understood that his coldness wasn't pain, it was punishment. He wanted me to feel humiliated. He wanted me to beg for forgiveness on my knees. He wanted a penance from me, but an unbalanced, unfair penance designed to feed his ego. The third event, a domino effect that worsened everything, was seeing that while he was showing his oxygen mask as a trophy, he already had my bags at the door. I didn't realize when he started putting my things in bags, but he did it with a speed that only someone who comes determined to expel you has. He told me it was better for me to leave, as if I were an intruder in the house I helped sustain. I felt a mix of anger and humiliation, because it's unbearable that the guilty party behaves like the owner of purity. I tried to tell him that this was cruel, that this was emotional abuse, that you don't kick someone out like that, but he continued like a robot. The lack of humanity at that moment was what hurt me the most, not the breakup, but the manner of execution. I moved around the living room as if in a nightmare, seeing my things piled up while he walked around with boxes, as if cleaning up a mess. I tried to talk to him about the sanctity of a home, about what it's supposed to mean to live together, about what's supposed to be protected, but he no longer wanted to listen because listening would force him to acknowledge his part. He said that I was responsible for my decisions and that he could no longer trust, as if trust is built on the silence of an exhausted woman. And the most hypocritical thing, he put on the suit of reason just when he already had the solution in hand, as if he could present himself to the world as the man who got treatment, while I was left as the unfaithful one. I realized that my threat to tell his mother hadn't worked as I expected, because he had already premeditated how to neutralize it. With the diagnosis, he could say he was sick, that he was in treatment, that he was getting better, and any claim of mine would sound like cruelty. That was the truly twisted part, the use of medicine as a moral shield. And I, being a person who respects health, was forced to recognize that I was in a narrative trap. He had already constructed the story where I was the problem and he was the renewed man. And he did it with coldness, not with tears. That's the difference between someone in pain and someone calculating. That night, when I finished taking my things out, I felt something I find hard to admit, not guilt, but a kind of emptiness. Because I always thought that even if Esteban was clumsy, at least he was a simple man. But in that week, he transformed into someone capable of orchestrating a clean execution, capable of leaving me talking to myself with my morality in my mouth. I found myself in the living room with my bags and thought that he was doing this so the world would applaud him, and that idea poisoned me. I didn't want to get back with him out of dependency. I wanted moral justice, for it to be recognized that I didn't cause this alone. And he was getting away with the title of victim and a silent mask in his hand. The end of that update is this. I left the house with the feeling that I was being expelled for a sin he provoked with his negligence, while he was left with the perfect stage. The last thing I saw was Esteban trying on the machine, breathing silently as if he had always been able to. And I understood that the immediate threat wasn't just losing the relationship, it was losing the narrative. Because if he establishes himself as a saint, I am left as a demon. And that for me is an injustice that I cannot allow to become truth. Comments on Update 2. Anonymous User 1 says, "You hit the lottery and you complain. The guy fixed the snoring in a week, and what you fixed was going to sleep with your friend. He threw you out, and for good reason." Opie's reply, "Your vision is so basic it's almost pitiful because you only count weeks when the damage was months. The fact that he solved the problem just when it suited him doesn't make him virtuous. It makes him an opportunist. And he threw me out with reason is the typical cry of someone who celebrates cruelty when it's disguised as justice. But don't worry, that kind of mentality always ends up paying with loneliness." Anonymous User 2 says, "You threatened him with his mom, sent him to the floor, cheated on him, and still say sacred home. You're a circus with a Bible in hand." Opie's reply, "How easy it is to mock when you've never sustained a home or a standard, because for you everything is a joke and morbidity. I don't use morality as decoration. I use it as a framework. And if I had to resort to his mother, it was because he only understands external shame, not internal conscience. And I'll leave the circus to you, who come to applaud the coldness of a man who got treatment late to look good." Update 3. 8 months have passed since the last update, and life has been cruelly ironic with me, as it often is with people who try to act with principles in a world that rewards shamelessness. At first, when I found myself out of the house, I had to rebuild quickly, because I'm not one to stay on the floor crying to be rescued. I had anger, I had humiliation, but I also had a certainty. I wasn't going to let my story be written by Esteban as if I were a caricature of the unfaithful woman. I tried to rebuild my routine, but it was difficult because stability is also a luxury when you're expelled from your own home. And in that vulnerability, David appeared as the only place where I could fall without being judged with hypocrisy. The first event of these 8 months was moving in with David. It wasn't a romantic fairy tale decision, it was a practical decision. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. David offered me a roof, he offered me support, and I thought that at least there I would have the silence that had been denied to me. I honestly believed that the universe was giving me a minimum of compensation. If I lost my house, at least I would gain rest. Besides, I kept telling myself that David had been the only one who understood me when Esteban left. And that matters, because you don't forget who supports you when you're broken. I settled in thinking that I would finally sleep full nights, that my body would recover, and that my mind would become clear again. But the unexpected consequence of that first event was discovering that the silence was a deceptive promise. David doesn't snore, that's true. And that part at first gave me an almost childlike relief, because I went to bed without anticipating a siren. However, David has what he lightly calls restless legs, as if it were a cute curiosity. And the reality is that he kicks. He kicks as if he's fighting someone invisible. The first few nights, I tried to ignore it because you want to be grateful when someone opens their door to you. But then I started waking up with blows, with bruises, with a tense body, with my heart on alert, as if my bed were a boxing ring. And the worst part is that David minimized it with a laugh, exactly how Esteban minimized my snoring, just with a different symptom and a different excuse. I try to talk about it calmly because I haven't lost my ability to guide, even if life wants to tame me. I explained that I was coming from months of sleep deprivation, that for me this wasn't a detail, that I needed real rest. David told me it was involuntary, that he couldn't control it, that I was exaggerating, and then I felt a disgusting pang. That same phrase, the same tone, the same inconsideration in a different uniform. I stared at him and thought that the problem wasn't the snoring, it was the male culture of treating a woman's rest as if it were an accessory. And for the first time I felt that maybe the world is made for one to always have to adapt, even if they promise you peace. The second chained event was the dog. David has a dog that he loves as if it were his child, which in theory is cute, but in practice it became another nightly torment. The animal barks at 3 in the morning as if defending the apocalypse, and David lets it because he says that dogs feel energies. I listened to the barking and felt like I was going crazy because I couldn't escape the noise or the movement. I tried to propose solutions, training it, taking it out more, putting it in another room, but David got offended as if I were attacking his soul. Suddenly, I was the villain for asking for a minimum of silence again. And then I began to understand that it wasn't just bad luck, it was a pattern of people who get used to me putting up with things. The third event, the one that really worsened everything by domino effect, was my financial dependence. I hadn't wanted to admit it, but the breakup with Esteban left me in a more fragile position than I like. Between moving, expenses, instability, and the time it took me to readjust, David became my partial financial support, and that detail changed the balance of power. With Esteban, I could impose penances. Because it was my house too, because I had moral and domestic authority. With David, every time I tried to set limits, he would remind me, even if sarcastically, that he was helping me. He didn't say it as an open threat, he said it as a reminder, and that reminder tied my tongue. I found myself in the silent humiliation of not being able to demand what I used to demand, because now my roof depended on his mood. And while I was living this new torture, on social media, I saw Esteban ironically flourishing. That was the cruelest part of all, because he not only solved the sleep problem, but he solved it for another woman. I saw photos where he looked rested, thinner, more smiling, and yes, although it hurts me, he looked better. The CPAP machine silenced him 100%, and he became the renewed man I spent months trying to educate, and now a new partner was enjoying that version, the version I helped forge with my constructive criticism, even if he likes to deny it. He was having coffees, traveling, smiling, as if I hadn't been the one who held it together during the difficult stage. And I, meanwhile, was waking up with kicks and barks, with dark circles and bruises, feeling punished for having tried to survive. There were nights when I would lie there looking at the ceiling with the dog barking in the background, and I felt an anger, so clean it was almost spiritual. I thought about how unfair it is that the world gives prizes to the one who plays the victim on time and punishments to the one who tries to hold the house together. I'm not a bad person, and I'm not going to accept that label just because my method of survival was uncomfortable for people. But I do recognize that fate put me in a situation where my authority was weakened. I could no longer impose penances. I could no longer speak from a place of security because I depended on David, and that dependence forced me to swallow my words, to accept crumbs of consideration, to endure what I would have corrected with firmness before. In those months, I tried to find ways out, but every way out had a cost. I thought about renting a place alone, but the numbers didn't add up. I thought about going back to Esteban to regain stability, and that idea made me nauseous because it would be accepting his narrative. I thought about asking my family for help, but I have pride, and I don't like to go back as the one who failed because I didn't fail, I survived. I got trapped in that modern cage where the roof comes with emotional conditions, and that's a penance I don't wish on anyone. I realized that my initial sacrifice, the one I thought would save my relationship, ended up being a chain of consequences that left me worse off. Now I sleep worse than before. Before, at least the noise had a clear culprit and a clear solution, even if he didn't want it. Now I have multiple nocturnal enemies, and none can be corrected without me losing my roof. I have bruises on my legs, dark circles that make me look sick, and a sense of defeat that I try not to name. And yes, I see on social media how well Esteban sleeps. How well he sleeps with his silent machine and his new partner, and I feel a rage that burns my stomach. The final threat, the hook that keeps me stuck in the present, is this. I still depend on David for now, and every night that passes I wonder how much more my body can take before it breaks completely, while the man who accused me of betrayal enjoys the silence he denied me. Comments on Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, "Karma hit you in high definition. You slept with David to get some sleep, and now the guy kicks you, and on top of that has an alarm dog. And Esteban is happily breathing with his machine. Opie's reply: how easy it is to celebrate someone else's suffering when you're not the one waking up with a marked body and a shattered mind. If you call injustice karma, then yours isn't morality. It's sadism disguised as a joke. And yes, it's ironic. But irony doesn't make Esteban a saint or me a villain. It only shows that the world rewards those who know how to sell themselves as victims. Anonymous user I says, the funniest thing is that you, moral superiority, disappeared when you became dependent on David. No more penances then, no. Just put up with it quietly. Opie's reply: what's funny to you is the evidence of something very serious, that financial dependence is a tool of control that you all normalize because it's convenient for you. I didn't disappear, I adjusted to survive. Which is what responsible people do when they have no margin. And if you think that makes me less moral, the only thing you're proving is that your morality is based on humiliating, not on understanding the real weight of circumstances.